Hello, I'm Astria, and this is the night my family laughed at me while I provided for them for 15 years. At Christmas dinner, my sister sneered, "How does it feel to be a loser?" And my parents sided with her. The table chuckled. I smiled. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I simply waited. And then I dropped a line that made her face go pale. How does a lifetime of giving suddenly vanish in the eyes of the ones you love? And what happens when the person they thought powerless finally turns the tables? The lights on our modest two-story home flickered warmly against the deep December night, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed hedges lining our quiet cul-de-sac in suburban Houston. From the moment I stepped into the living room, a familiar tension wrapped around me like the heavy winter coat I had shrugged off at the door. Guests were arriving, their laughter filling the room, but my gaze instinctively searched for the small moments of disregard that always seemed to find me in family gatherings. I carried the final dish I had spent hours preparing into the dining area, my hands slightly trembling despite my best efforts to appear composed. 15 years of quietly shouldering financial responsibilities, of providing for a family that never seemed to notice, had taught me to be invisible, yet present, an existence both exhausting and strangely comforting in its predictability. The table was already set, gleaming silverware and polished glasses arranged with the precision of a boutique catalog. Isolde had taken special care with her friends from the boutique and church circle seated around her, ensuring the air hummed with admiration for her successes, while my contributions remained unmentioned, quietly erased beneath the festive sparkle. I moved to the far end, placing the casserole down with care, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The subtle cues were everywhere, a whisper from a neighbor. Isolde's boutique is the reason this house looks so festive this year, and a pointed glance from Vera, our mother, as if to underline the significance of my silence. I felt my heart tighten, a familiar ache settling in, but I kept my hands steady, arranging the final touches on the table. Dinner began, a carefully orchestrated dance of polite smiles and camera flashes. Phones emerged to capture the perfect family facade, while laughter and forced compliments ricocheted across the room. I sat down last, quietly, aware of every eye skimming past me without acknowledgement. The roast glistened under the soft chandelier light, yet it seemed as though the warmth and joy of the season had been reserved for everyone else. And then, the bomb dropped. Isolde, holding a glass of red wine with the casual elegance she always wore like armor, leaned slightly forward and, with that familiar smirk that had haunted my memory for years, said, "So Astria, how does it feel to be a loser?" The words struck harder than any slap. The laughter that followed was a chorus of betrayal. Neighbors, friends, even my own family, none intervened. I felt a heat rise in my cheeks, my pulse quickening as I grappled with the sting of public humiliation. Vera's smirk and Indira's silent chewing felt like a confirmation of everything I had endured quietly for years. My value measured only by others' convenience and amusement. I could hear the giggles of my niece, her innocence untainted by the cruelty she echoed, and my peripheral vision caught Isolde's friend discreetly recording the moment for her social media. The camera's lens, pointed directly at me, transformed my quiet indignation into spectacle. Vera's voice cut through the murmurs, dripping with sarcasm. "Well, dear, some people were just born to support others, I suppose." I nodded slightly, forcing myself to rise and pour a glass of water. My hands betrayed me, trembling as the cold liquid splashed into the glass. The room felt unbearably small, every laugh and whisper amplifying the humiliation. But deep inside, something simmered, a quiet, controlled fury, an awareness that the game was not over, that every subtle slight had only been a prelude. I set the glass down, took a deep breath, and allowed my gaze to meet Isolde's directly. Calm, collected, measured. My voice low but sharp, carrying a weight they had all ignored for far too long. "You might want to double-check whose name is on that deed before calling anyone a loser." The room froze. Forks hovered mid-air, wine glasses paused at lips, and even the soft clink of silverware against china seemed suspended in the tension I had summoned. Silence stretched uncomfortably, the kind that makes laughter feel obscene and glances bite deeper than words could. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Isolde's eyes, a crack in her carefully constructed superiority. I sat down again, my hands still slightly unsteady, but my posture firm as I cut into the roast. The aroma of rosemary and garlic mingled with the sharp sting of confrontation, creating a surreal cocktail of the ordinary and the extraordinary. Around the table, the world continued, guests adjusting their napkins, neighbors exchanging uneasy glances. But the atmosphere had shifted, imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. A subtle current of tension now ran beneath the festive exterior, hinting at a reckoning that no one at the table had yet imagined. I reminded myself to breathe, to let the simmering awareness of my own worth anchor me. Each laugh, each whisper, each glance from those who had colluded in my quiet erasure only strengthened the resolve I had honed over 15 years. I would not erupt in public, not tonight. My response had been quiet, controlled, but potent. A seed of disruption had been planted in this seemingly perfect family tableau, and it would grow in due time, silently, inexorably. Even as the conversation drifted to safe topics, holiday plans, the boutique's new lines, who brought what dessert, I felt the weight of observation settling in. My nieces and nephews watched with wide, curious eyes, unaware of the undercurrents. I allowed myself a faint, almost imperceptible smile, acknowledging the depth of the battlefield I had inherited without a single blow thrown. I carried the final dish from the kitchen into the living room later, setting it down gently beside the dessert table, and caught Indira's eyes briefly. His expression was unreadable, but I suspected he recognized, even if silently, that the quiet balance of family power had shifted, if only slightly, tonight. Vera, on the other hand, glanced at me with her practiced evaluation, the same one that had always sought to minimize, to control, to define my place in her narrative. She had underestimated me, as they all had. Dinner continued, a carefully choreographed ritual of appearances, yet I moved through it with a sense of detachment and focus. Each smile I returned, each polite nod, was a strategic choice, a quiet assertion of presence. My mind traced over the words I had spoken, the silence that had followed, and I considered the next steps, already weaving scenarios and contingencies in the back of my mind. This evening, seemingly ordinary in its tinsel and candles, had become a chessboard, and I was no longer merely a piece to be moved. As the final course was served, the tension under the table was nearly tangible, a silent storm simmering beneath the carefully polished surface. I reached for my water, hands now steady, heart racing with the exhilarating awareness of control. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's laughter broke through the momentary stillness, reminding me that the world moved on, but within these walls, a reckoning had begun. And as I carved the last slice of roast, I saw Isolde's hand tremble slightly, the first visible sign that my words had landed with a force she hadn't anticipated. The room remained polite on the surface, but I knew the next move would be hers, and I would be ready. She picked up her fork again, and as she cut into the roast, I saw her hands shake for the first time. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, yet in that moment I felt an electric thrill of quiet satisfaction. My lips pressed together, a subtle, controlled smile hiding the storm swirling inside me. The evening was far from over, and already the tides were beginning to shift. The clinking of silverware continued around the table, yet an odd stillness had settled over me. Everyone seemed determined to act as though Isolde's cruelty had been a harmless quip. She refilled her wineglass, a little too eagerly, her eyes darting toward mine now and then, with that mix of defiance and insecurity I had learned to read so well over the years. Vera, seated at the head of the table, looked at me with that calculated maternal smirk, like a chess master pleased with her opponent's obliviousness. Indira, ever silent, seemed lost in thought, as though the words spoken were nothing but background noise, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he had registered my subtle warning. I slowly carved another slice of roast, forcing myself to focus on the rhythm, the knife slicing, the aroma filling the air, the murmurs of conversation. The living room, with its twinkling lights and festive decorations, felt like a stage set for someone else's story, one in which I was merely a supporting character, invisible despite my contributions. For 15 years I had funded these Christmases, arranging the lights, the centerpiece, even paying for the gleaming dinnerware without acknowledgement, quietly sustaining a tradition that everyone now credited to my sister. The unfairness simmered beneath my skin, a bitter warmth that refused to cool. After the last course, Vera clinked her glass, summoning attention to the living room. "Let's thank Isolde for always making the house look so magical during the holidays," she said, her voice lilting with feigned warmth. Guests murmured assent, smiles plastered across their faces, unaware that every string of lights, every delicate ornament had come from my own silent efforts. The injustice gnawed at me, a familiar ache I had learned to mask with polite nods and measured expressions. I sat stiffly on the sofa, observing as my years of devotion were handed over like a trophy to someone else. I forced myself to smile, to lift my glass in a muted toast. My mind catalogued every detail. The way Daisy, Isolde's daughter, beamed as if she had designed the decorations herself, the subtle positioning of friends to ensure I remained at the edge of photographs, the almost imperceptible way Vera's eyes avoided mine. Even the sound of my own voice in that soft clink of glass felt foreign in a room that had long ignored my existence. When Vera suggested a group photo, I moved toward the living room with cautious patience, standing at the back where I would be least noticed. Isolde stretched her arm across the line just enough to shield her shoulder, a deliberate act that forced me further into the margins. The camera's lens focused on her triumphs, her curated holiday persona, leaving me in the periphery. Vera quipped, "We'll print it for the album, unless Astria wants to Photoshop herself in later." The laughter that followed cut sharper than any insult from earlier. It was a reminder that my presence was negotiable, a detail to be edited out, ignored, or diminished at will. Later, I ascended to the guest room, where a small stack of the latest family photo albums had been laid out. My fingers traced the glossy covers, hesitation settling in my chest. Flipping through the pages, I realized the extent of my erasure. Birthdays, graduations, vacations. I was present in memory only if faintly, often without acknowledgement. An old graduation dinner, funded entirely by me, was captioned, "Proud family moment, Isolde supporting Daisy through college." The words cut through me like ice, the realization of being both architect and invisible witness of my family's milestones pressing down heavily. I sank into the armchair by the window, letting the faint glow of the Christmas lights spill over the album and my reflection. It was a reflection I barely recognized, the woman who had quietly kept this family afloat, now facing the stark evidence of her own invisibility. A question pressed itself into my mind, insistent and unyielding. If I had never truly been part of them, what had I been protecting all these years? My chest tightened, a slow ache settling over the silence of the room. From the corner of my eye, Daisy appeared, curious and unknowing, tugging at her mother's sleeve. The innocence in her wide-eyed glance struck me with a paradoxical blend of warmth and sorrow. Even as I was denied acknowledgement, the next generation thrived, blissfully unaware of the quiet sacrifice it had taken to preserve these moments. I realized that my anger and frustration were not simply for recognition. They were for the integrity of my own identity, long suppressed beneath the family's curated image. As the evening shadows lengthened, I walked over to the small desk by the guest room window. I reached for my phone, not to text anyone, not to apologize or explain, but to begin the first act of reclaiming my agency, files, accounts, records, everything that silently documented my contributions would be sorted, cataloged, and preserved. Tonight had demonstrated that patience alone could no longer suffice. If my family wished to erase me, I would ensure the truth existed elsewhere, where it could not be ignored, where it could not be co-opted. Even as I sat there, scrolling through emails and receipts, a sense of clarity emerged from the simmering discontent. The quiet war had begun, and I had the advantage of being underestimated. The guests downstairs remained oblivious, voices drifting up the staircase, discussing trivialities and exchanging polite laughter. I allowed myself a slow exhale, feeling the weight of years subtly lift as resolve took its place. My presence mattered, even if they refused to acknowledge it. Later, standing by the window and looking out over the street's modest winter glow, I thought about the twists and turns the night might yet take. The table downstairs, filled with laughter and curated appearances, had no idea that I was preparing a silent response that would ripple through their assumptions, leaving them scrambling in the aftermath of recognition. It was not revenge born of malice, but of rightful reclamation, proof that invisibility was no longer my lot. The reflection in the window merged with the glow of the Christmas lights, my face calm but alert. I was poised on the edge of action, where patience and strategy intertwined. Tonight had shown me the fracture in their facade. Tomorrow, the repercussions would be deliberate, measured, and undeniable. The room was silent, but in that silence, a plan was forming, each thought carefully considered, and each action waiting its perfect moment. I closed the album, careful not to disturb the quiet. The misalignment of gratitude and recognition had become painfully clear. For years, I had shielded myself from hurt by invisibility. Now, I understood that my presence could command attention, that subtlety and intellect were more potent than any outburst. The calm before the storm had arrived, and in that stillness, I felt the quiet thrill of inevitability. I wiped the tears off my screen and opened a new Google Doc titled Cost Summary, 2009 to 2024. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating just for a moment as the weight of betrayal pressed down on me. The quiet of the guest room seemed amplified in the early morning darkness, punctuated only by the soft hum of the street lamp outside the window. I could still hear the distant murmur of the house, as if the walls themselves were holding their collective breath, waiting for me to make the first move. The emails and drafts I scrolled through were a testament to my years of invisible labor, every detail meticulously organized, every expense accounted for. And yet, in the shadow of these records lay the cruelest twist. The video I had created for Mother's 70th birthday, my careful editing, heartfelt voiceover, and all the subtle nuances I had woven to capture her joy, had been rewritten. When it went public, it bore Isolde's name at the beginning, accompanied by her boutique's logo, while mine had been erased completely. My chest tightened as I recalled the sound of Mother's laughter in the original clip. In this altered version, her joy felt unfamiliar, as though I had never been the one to capture it. I remembered asking Isolde to upload the video. She had smiled innocently, waving her hand as if brushing away responsibility. "Sure, I'll tidy it up a little. You're not great with online formats anyway," she had said. I had laughed, too trusting, and stepped aside. Later, Vera had hugged Isolde tightly, whispering, "You're the only one who really remembers me." My own contributions had been invisibly subsumed under her attention and accolades. It was a pattern I had begun to notice, a history of being replaced or ignored at every critical moment, always expected to bear the labor quietly while the spotlight turned elsewhere. I sat back and stared at the glow of the laptop screen. In the corner of the guest room, the small Christmas tree cast long shadows, its lights flickering faintly. I felt a strange mixture of grief and clarity. Grief for the erasure, for the betrayal that had been normalized over years, and clarity that my silence had never been a protection, but a trap. If I wanted acknowledgement, or even just the satisfaction of truth being known, I would have to seize it myself. No more passive contributions, no more quiet subservience. I would reclaim my story. I opened an old email thread, one from the week leading up to Mother's birthday. Attached was a receipt for every single item I had orchestrated, the floral arrangements, the catering, the videographer, even the little details of table settings. Each line item was meticulously noted, all funded through my firm's account and staff benefits. Beneath the receipts was a note from Elowen, my tech-savvy family friend, who had managed the upload for me. "Let me know if your mom liked it. I sent it exactly how you wanted." Her words now felt like a bittersweet reminder. She had done exactly what I asked, and yet the final credit had been co-opted. The truth had been in my hands, yet visibility had been stolen from me. I leaned forward, fingers flying over the keyboard, as I began to organize every document, every receipt, every draft into a new folder, each file labeled, each contribution cataloged. The meticulousness was almost therapeutic, a way to convert anger into strategy. I knew the moment I had been waiting for, years, really, was approaching. The moment I would stop being invisible, the moment they would finally understand the scope of what had been silently provided. From the corner of the room, I glanced at the old photo albums that had been sitting untouched since yesterday. My presence had been largely omitted from family milestones, graduations, anniversaries, vacations, moments I had financed, planned, and, in many ways, saved. The pattern of erasure was undeniable. The realization hit like a cold wave. These were not just casual oversights. This was a sustained effort to replace me with a more visible version, a curated narrative that suited their perception of family prestige. And the most painful part was that everyone had been complicit, smiling, laughing, pretending nothing was amiss. The room felt smaller suddenly, the silence heavy with all the conversations left unsaid, all the acknowledgments withheld. I breathed in deeply, trying to anchor myself. The early morning was still quiet outside, yet inside I was awakening to the truth of my own agency. If I could not control their recognition, I could control my documentation. I could prepare for the moment when the veil of deception would be lifted, when my contributions would be undeniable and verifiable. I thought of Elowen and the integrity she had shown, unaware that her work had been appropriated. I thought of Isolde, smug in her position, convinced she had successfully masked my efforts. And I thought of myself, for too long content to be quiet, to allow their narrative to overwrite mine. No longer. The files I was compiling would serve as both shield and sword. When the time came, they would see that the quiet one had not been powerless, merely patient. The hours passed, and I moved seamlessly from document to document, cross-referencing dates and transactions, ensuring every detail was accounted for. My focus was absolute. I could hear the muffled sounds of sleep from the other rooms of the house, unaware of the mental storm brewing just a floor above them. The living room glimmered faintly, the decorations a silent testimony to my labor, their unacknowledged brilliance highlighting the depth of the betrayal. I felt a surge of determination, the kind that comes only when clarity follows grief. This was no longer just about credit. It was about reclaiming my identity, the tangible proof that I had never been invisible to myself. Finally, I paused, hand hovering over the mouse. The Google Doc glowed on the screen, rows upon rows of figures, receipts, and notes. My chest swelled with a strange pride, meticulous, quiet, unwavering. Tonight, I had begun the work that would undo decades of erasure. The night outside had deepened, the faint hum of the street lamp casting elongated shadows across the room. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the tension in my shoulders release, replaced with a cold, precise resolve. "This ends tonight," I whispered softly to the room, knowing no one would hear, yet the words carried weight. Every step I had taken had led to this moment, the careful, deliberate planning to reclaim what was mine. I would no longer allow invisibility to define my place in the family, nor would I permit them to dictate the narrative of my life. Their ignorance was temporary. The evidence I was preserving would be permanent. As the first hint of dawn painted the suburban rooftops in muted gold, I closed the laptop with deliberate care. My fingers lingered over the keyboard, savoring the quiet victory of preparation. The Christmas lights outside twinkled in the early morning hush, reflecting my determination. I had transformed my anguish into strategy, my invisibility into documentation, and my quiet despair into a foundation for action. I rose from the chair, moving quietly to the window to watch the snowless Houston streets glisten under the faint glow of streetlights. There was a sense of calm in the air, but beneath it, a tempest had begun. I understood now that the narrative they had constructed without me was fragile, and soon it would be challenged. The dawn promised no sudden miracles, but it did promise opportunity, and I would be ready. I walked past the dining room table, the one I had bought years ago, my fingers brushing over the polished wood as I ascended to the kitchen. The sun had risen over suburban Houston, spilling weak, golden light across the counters, highlighting dust I had never noticed in the quiet of early morning. The house was eerily still, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a secret waiting to be revealed. Coffee in hand, I sat at the kitchen island, letting the warmth seep into my chilled hands, while the spreadsheet I had begun last night hummed quietly in the back of my mind. Every line, every total, every allocation was more than numbers. It was memory, silent proof of a lifetime of unacknowledged effort. But I started adding new entries, the mundane tasks of finance becoming a map of devotion. Mortgage payments, utility bills, Daisy's tuition, Vera's recent medical co-payments, and even the subtle bailout for Isolda's boutique, all processed through my firm's internal account system. Each item carried with it a weight, a story of sleepless nights, careful budgeting, quiet sacrifices no one had ever seen. As I entered the final numbers, I felt a subtle satisfaction, a sensation of reclaiming something that had been quietly stolen. The house still slept, but in my mind, a quiet revolution had begun. I logged into the bank, the familiar portal blinking up at me like an old confidant. With precise clicks, I canceled auto payments linked to family members, withdrew access, and made adjustments that would ripple quietly through the day. No emails, no confrontations, no immediate explanations, just deliberate, silent resistance. Each withdrawal felt like a heartbeat, steady and defiant. Later, I scheduled a consultation with my firm's legal team to review account authorizations and liabilities. Everything was methodical. Everything had its place. This was my war, fought not with anger, but with strategy. Stepping outside into the backyard, the crisp morning air touched my face, making me inhale sharply, grounding me in the reality of the day. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring both the warmth and the calm I forced into myself. Indira appeared at the patio door, pausing as if trying to gauge my intentions. He opened his mouth once, hesitated, then simply nodded and moved along. For the first time, I didn't chase after his silence. I allowed it to hang, like a warning and an acknowledgement rolled into one. The tension between us was palpable, yet I was no longer desperate for approval. My silence had become armor. Vera appeared next, quietly entering the kitchen, holding a worn shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes, once filled with maternal comfort, now glimmered with a subtle worry. "I know you think we don't appreciate you," she said softly, her voice just above the hum of the refrigerator. "But your sister, she's fragile. Always has been. You're stronger." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Her intention was clear. Caution, masked as care. I took a measured sip of coffee, letting the warmth steady my thoughts before responding. "Strength doesn't mean silence, Mom. It just means I took longer to speak." My voice was calm, even, devoid of accusation, but rich with the weight of unspoken years. She tilted her head, eyes softening, but her warning was implicit. "If you make a scene, you'll break this family." I felt the irony, that a family broken over years of neglect and favoritism would place the burden of preservation on me. Turning back to my spreadsheet, I marveled at the accumulation of quiet sacrifices transformed into concrete data. Each line became a testament not only to my work, but to the endurance I had cultivated, the patience I had wielded like a shield. I texted Elowen, brief and precise. "Start backing up everything. I'm not playing dumb anymore." The message was simple, but it carried an undercurrent of intent, a signal that the tide had shifted. My years of methodical silence had reached a threshold, and I was preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I moved to the refrigerator and opened it, letting the cold air wash over me as I retrieved a small container of leftover pie. The sweetness was grounding, a reminder that even amidst quiet rebellion, life required sustenance and patience. As I bit into it, I considered the ripple effect of my actions. The withdrawal of financial support would not go unnoticed. Small tremors of unease might spread through the family, subtle, indirect, but unavoidable. And I would watch, carefully, strategically, as the dynamics shifted in real time. By mid-morning, the house had begun to stir. A soft clatter from the upstairs hallway signaled movement. Isolda, most likely, preparing for the day, unaware of the quiet recalibration underway below. I let the sound pass without reaction, keeping my composure, observing patterns, noting gestures, and cataloging small betrayals. My mind was a ledger, just like the one on my laptop, balancing credit and accountability, intention and result. I poured another cup of coffee, standing near the kitchen sink, eyes fixed on the window where snowless light illuminated the yard. Memories of overlooked birthdays, silent contributions, and erased achievements flowed through me like a cold wind. And yet, a strange clarity accompanied the bitterness, a realization that these actions, deliberate and methodical, were the first true steps in reclaiming autonomy. No one had offered acknowledgement, no one had extended gratitude. The power to recognize value, to ensure accountability, now rested entirely with me. Vera lingered in the doorway, her voice softer now. "You're careful, Astria. Too careful sometimes," she murmured. I nodded, allowing the observation to land without confrontation. The lesson had been learned over years. Caution was survival, planning was power. I closed my eyes briefly, inhaling the aroma of brewing coffee mixed with holiday pine, grounding myself for the day ahead. Every action, every number entered, every email archived was a step toward reclaiming my story. The morning progressed with the rhythm of quiet revolution. I checked my phone, noting the read receipts, archived threads, and financial adjustments that would ripple through the family like gentle seismic shifts. Each subtle move was intentional, strategic, a chess game with invisible pieces where the end game was recognition, justice, and reclaiming dignity. I felt a sense of empowerment, calm and measured, like a conductor orchestrating a symphony that only she could hear. Finally, standing near the patio, watching the sunlight angle across the suburban lawns, I felt a surge of determination. The withdrawal of my financial support and the strategic documentation of my contributions were not just acts of defiance, they were acts of survival. And in this calm, methodical silence, I had discovered my power. The family might laugh, misattribute credit, or pretend ignorance, but the truth, meticulously recorded, could not be undone. I left the room, my steps deliberate and measured, the echo of Isolde's laugh trailing behind me like an unwelcome shadow. The warmth of the afternoon sun filtering through the living room windows felt almost hostile, mocking in its cheerfulness. I paused at the threshold of Vera's study, inhaling deeply, and ran my fingers across the polished edge of the desk. The quiet hum of the central heating mixed with the faint scent of old books and pine garlands lingering from the Christmas tree downstairs. Every sound, every aroma seemed amplified in the stillness, underscoring the loneliness I had felt for decades. It was as if the house itself was conspiring to remind me that while the world outside celebrated, I had been erased inside these walls. I carried my laptop to the armchair by the bay window, its cushions softened from years of quiet sitting, and opened it with a precision born of sleepless nights and meticulous planning. The spreadsheet I had started yesterday, now expanded and color-coded, displayed a mosaic of devotion rendered invisible. Mortgages, utilities, tuition payments, medical copays, loan adjustments for Isolde's boutique. Each entry a testimony to years of unacknowledged contribution. My eyes traced each line, scanning for discrepancies, cross-referencing bank statements, receipts, and email confirmations. The magnitude of what I had given, and what had been claimed by others, hit me in waves. But instead of despair, I felt a cold, calculating clarity. This was not vengeance, it was recognition. Finally, it would be undeniable. By late afternoon, I uploaded the final version to a private cloud, sending a copy to Elowin and my lawyer, leaving one untouched for myself. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating only briefly before pressing send to the family group chat. The message was concise, almost austere, attaching documentation to clarify a few financial misunderstandings over the years. I'll be stepping back from all shared expenses effective immediately. No preamble, no apology, no flourish of indignation, just the unembellished truth, data presented as quiet authority. I leaned back, inhaling deeply, letting the weight of the action settle over me like frost on a winter morning. The room seemed to contract in anticipation, waiting for a response that I knew might never come. I didn't have to wait long. Vera, appearing briefly at the doorway, chose silence, her lips pressed together in that familiar way, the hesitation of someone unsure how to navigate the storm she had long enabled. Indira opened his office door just enough to peer out, his expression restrained. "You didn't have to," he said softly, almost a whisper, a remnant of authority tempered by years of quiet complicity. I stared at him, my jaw firm, my chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. But I did, and you let them act like I didn't, I said evenly. Each word weighed and deliberate, a measure of accountability I had been denied for too long. He looked away, muttering under his breath, and the stillness that followed felt charged, a delicate tension holding its breath. Memories crept uninvited into my awareness, a flashback sharper than any winter wind. Daisy's emergency dental surgery, the night I had scrambled resources, transferred funds, and quietly ensured her care without fanfare. The thank you post Isolde had shared on social media later. Thanks to Mom and me for handling it so smoothly. The words, casual and careless, were an erasure of my labor, a pattern repeated over years, folding invisibility into acts of generosity. I pressed my hands to the keyboard, pausing, remembering, and feeling the old sting of erasure. Yet, for the first time, the sting was tempered by resolve. I leaned back in the armchair, fingers resting on the spreadsheet tabs, each color-coded box now a small victory. This evidence, archived and time-stamped, was a shield as well as a weapon. Elowen's confirmation pinged softly on my phone, a brief but necessary reminder that I wasn't alone in this acknowledgement of truth. The tension coiled, an almost tangible presence, as the day crept slowly toward evening. Sunlight angled through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor, highlighting the contrast between what was visible and what had been hidden. My quiet storm had begun, measured and deliberate, yet impossible to ignore. The house remained muted, almost complicit, as I stood and moved toward the dining room. The table, a silent witness to countless overlooked moments, gleamed under the afternoon light. My eyes swept across it, noting the placement of chairs, the slight scuff where Daisy had once dropped her cup of cocoa, the indentation left by years of careful preparation that had gone uncredited. I felt a strange combination of empowerment and grief. The evidence was undeniable, yet it underscored all that had been ignored, all that had been taken for granted. The weight of acknowledgement was both liberating and suffocating. My phone buzzed, a subtle intrusion into the quiet. A message from Isolde appeared, brief and calculated. Wow. Merry Christmas to you too. Guess we know how you really feel. I read it slowly, the corners of my mouth lifting in a controlled smile. Nothing dramatic, no explosion, just the satisfaction of quiet truth delivered. I closed the device and placed it on the side table, letting the silence expand around me. The room seemed to breathe with me, the air charged with a mixture of holiday calm and unspoken confrontation. This was only the beginning, a quiet assertion of presence that could no longer be ignored. As I walked toward the hallway, ready to retreat to the solitude of the guest room to reflect on the day's progress, Vera's voice reached me, soft yet piercing. You've made a mistake, Astria. Her words were not a question, not an accusation, just the weight of realization that the scales had shifted. I paused, letting her tone linger in the air, letting the implications settle. It was a warning, yes, but also an acknowledgement. The first tremors of awareness from the family had begun, and I felt a subtle thrill. The balance had begun to tip, and I was ready to maintain the course. The afternoon stretched on, the quiet punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and occasional holiday greetings drifting from outside. I retreated upstairs briefly to organize additional documents, creating a chronological record that left no gap for dispute. The meticulousness of the process grounded me, turning grief into strategy, invisibility into documented authority. Each note, each entry, was both shield and sledgehammer, proof that my contributions were real and undeniable. I sat back finally, surveying the room, the soft light of late afternoon filtering through the blinds. The weight of the day pressed on my shoulders, yes, but it was measured now, balanced by clarity and resolve. The quiet empowerment of evidence, the strategic withdrawal of support, and the deliberate exposure of truth. These were my tools. No one would deny them. No one could. For the first time in years, I was visible in every calculation, in every documented effort, in every proof of my dedication. and it felt, finally, like a Christmas gift to myself. Undeniable presence, unassailable proof. I paused at the kitchen doorway, letting Vera's whispered words settle like frost on the windowsill. The house felt colder somehow, the mid-morning light slanting across the counters revealing the faint dust on my coffee mug, the lingering scent of last night's roast still clinging to the air. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam rising slowly, and felt Seraphine's quiet presence behind me. She placed her hand lightly on my shoulder and murmured, "You did the right thing." Her reassurance carried a weight that reminded me I wasn't entirely alone, that even amidst betrayal and family politics, there existed allies who understood the quiet endurance of the overlooked. The kitchen remained eerily silent. Vera moved past me, eyes averted, and I realized that her avoidance was a subtle acknowledgement, a tacit approval of my actions, however grudgingly given. Isolde, predictably, was nowhere in sight. I sipped my coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground me, my mind moving in deliberate steps through the spreadsheet, the archived emails, and the evidence I had compiled. Each number, each entry was a small monument to years of silent sacrifice. This was my armor, my statement without spectacle. The sudden sound of a slamming front door made me startle. My heart picked up pace as I turned to see Isolde storming in, her presence commanding the kitchen in an instant. She flung a stack of documents onto the counter, her fingers trembling with indignation. "What the hell do you mean your name is on the deed?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unrelenting. I didn't flinch. I placed my cup down, letting the clink against the counter punctuate the tension. Calmly, I replied, "Read page 2. You signed over partial equity when you asked for help in 2012. You don't remember?" The memory of her boutique shop, saved by a second mortgage co-signed and funded entirely by me, surfaced vividly. Every late night, every financial risk I had assumed to keep her dream afloat, flashed in stark contrast to her current outrage. She advanced, her anger palpable, trying to guilt me into submission. "You've always hated that I get attention. This is just punishment," she spat, her words a mixture of defensiveness and entitlement. I leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with her. "No, this is accountability. You've mistaken invisibility for approval," I said evenly, each syllable measured. The room held its breath. A silence stretched taut between us, only broken by the faint hum of the refrigerator. It wasn't anger driving my voice, it was precision. Strategic dominance, earned through years of quiet endurance, now manifesting in calm confrontation. Later, as I gathered the remaining receipts and correspondence, Seraphine approached me with a folded envelope she had retrieved from the morning mail pile. I unfolded it carefully, the elegant stationery revealing a letter addressed to Isolde from a luxury brand sponsoring her boutique. The words confirmed what I had suspected, but had held at bay. Due to internal financial discrepancies flagged during review, our partnership will be temporarily suspended. My lips pressed together in a tight line, satisfaction mingling with a touch of dread. This was the first ripple of consequences, the tangible result of my meticulous withdrawal and exposure. My gaze traveled across the room, noting Vera's face as she lingered near the fireplace. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief moment there was acknowledgement, silent, uneasy, but undeniable. I folded the letter with deliberate slowness, feeling the crisp edges beneath my fingers. The weight of consequence pressed against me, not for me, but against the family members who had long overlooked the foundation I had built beneath their comfort. I walked to the window, observing the quiet suburban street bathed in soft sunlight. The snow from last night had melted into glistening patches, reflective like my thoughts, clarity in the aftermath of stormy nights. They assumed this was the end of it, that exposure alone would suffice, but I knew better. This was only the beginning, the tipping of a scale that had long been unbalanced. The mid-morning hours passed with a peculiar quietude. I moved to the living room, organizing files, verifying balances, ensuring every document had its place in the narrative I was building. Each click of the mouse, each printed page was an act of reclamation, a reaffirmation that my presence was now visible, unignorable. Elowen's earlier text reminders of backup protocols flashed in my mind. I had followed every precaution, every strategy we had discussed. There would be no loopholes for erasure this time, no misappropriated credit, no invisible labor. By late morning, the house seemed to hold its breath, aware of the subtle storm brewing beneath its decorated surfaces. I carried a stack of files toward the guest room, my steps quiet but purposeful, and glanced at the framed family photos that hung slightly askew from last night's chaos. My reflection in the glass revealed determination, a silent vow that years of invisibility would not go unremarked. The avalanche I had set in motion was small, precise, inevitable, every action calculated, every disclosure intentional. I had learned the power of quiet defiance, and now it was time to let consequences unfold naturally. Seraphine's presence remained my anchor, her steady gaze offering reassurance without words. I placed the files under my bed, in the folder labeled "If They Ever Ask," the very title a quiet provocation and safeguard. This was the pivot point, the moment where silent planning transformed into tangible authority. My mind cataloged every potential reaction, every consequence, and prepared contingency paths for each scenario. I felt no thrill of vindictiveness, only the calm intensity of measured action. This was strategy executed flawlessly, the discipline of truth manifesting in real time. I paused at the doorway, looking down the hallway toward the quiet bedrooms. The house was still, the faint ticking of a clock filling spaces left by absent voices. A soft breeze from an open window brushed across the papers on the counter, whispering reminders of winter's cold and the clarity it demanded. I allowed myself a brief moment to breathe, knowing that soon, the house, the family, and even Isolde herself would feel the weight of years of misattributed efforts. This quiet power, invisible to the untrained eye, was potent, like the calm before a storm, measured but unrelenting. The evening settled over the house like a heavy velvet curtain, dimming the sharp edges of the living room's polished surfaces. I had spent the better part of the day in deliberate quiet, moving between the guest room, sorting through the folders, and the dining room, ensuring every document, every screenshot, every email was accounted for. When I finally opened the folder labeled "If They Ever Ask," a wave of controlled anticipation surged through me. It wasn't the thrill of vengeance, but the calm certainty of preparation. Photocopies of receipts, bank statements, signed agreements, texts from Isolde pleading for financial assistance, and even voice recordings of Vera asking me to keep quiet for the family's sake, lay meticulously organized in neat stacks. Each paper was a small testament, a factual monument to years of silent labor and sacrifice. I reached for the final document at the bottom of the pile. It was a notarized agreement for the second mortgage, co-signed by Isolde and witnessed by Vera. The ink had dried years ago, yet it now felt like a ticking bomb waiting to be set off. I held it in my hands, tracing the signature with my fingertip, imagining how long it had taken Isolde to sign it without realizing the implications fully. Every step I had taken, the silent funding, the meticulous logging of expenses, the strategic withdrawal of financial support, had led to this moment. I set the papers down carefully and exhaled, allowing the weight of preparation to settle into my bones. By early evening, I invited everyone to the living room. The furniture, usually arranged for comfort and appearances, now served as the stage for confrontation. Using Elowen's remote access, I projected the cost summary and supporting documents onto the television screen. Vera gasped, stepping back slightly, while Indira attempted to interject, only to falter as I guided the narrative with calm precision. The truth was on display, unflinching and undeniable. I watched Isolde's face, a mixture of disbelief and outrage, as she realized that the years of uncredited labor, the financial support, and the silent sacrifices were all cataloged, referenced, and documented. Her voice rose in panic. "You've been building a case against your own family?" she accused, her eyes darting to Vera as if seeking an ally. I met her gaze evenly, steady as the folds of the documents I held. "No. I've been building a truth you made me bury," I replied. The room felt taut, every heart pausing in anticipation. Isolde's frustration escalated. She grabbed a glass from the coffee table and flung it across the room. It shattered against the wall with a harsh clatter, glass fragments skittering across the polished hardwood floor. Vera rushed forward, her voice quivering. "Don't do this, Astria. You'll destroy everything." I shook my head slightly, the calm in my voice firm and unwavering. "Everything you built was on silence. I'm choosing sound." The simple words hung in the air, resonating like a bell tolling, echoing in every corner of the room. Indira stepped forward, attempting reason. "This can be handled privately," he suggested, though the defeat in his posture betrayed his lack of conviction. I met his eyes and spoke slowly. "Privately is what let it fester. Now it ends publicly." The clarity in my tone carried no malice, only inevitability. Elowen joined via video call, her presence a silent but formidable reminder that the law was no longer a silent partner to Isolde's advantage. She addressed the room directly, her voice firm and precise. "All financial liabilities and assets tied to Astria will be reviewed legally starting next week. Any misuse will be pursued accordingly." Vera's face drained of color. The air felt thick, heavy with the recognition that the scales had shifted irreversibly. Isolde, realizing the consequences, bolted from the room in a storm of indignation, leaving a trail of unsettled papers and trembling voices. Indira, defeated and quiet, walked toward the kitchen, shoulders slumped, the fight drained from him. Seraphine, who had been observing quietly, offered a nod of approval, an acknowledgement of the subtle victory earned through careful strategy rather than dramatic confrontation. The room, once filled with the energy of familial control and subtle manipulations, now held a charged stillness. I moved to the couch, seating myself deliberately, and opened my phone. With a single deliberate swipe, I deleted the family chat. All conversations, all potential avenues for misinterpretation or deflection, were gone. "There's nothing left to explain," I whispered to myself, the sound absorbed by the empty space around me. This was the culmination of years of meticulous patience, a demonstration that the quietest voice, when armed with truth, could not only be heard but could reshape the entire landscape of perception and accountability. The evening light shifted toward twilight, casting long shadows across the room. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, reflecting on the sequence of events, the careful gathering of evidence, the withdrawal of silent labor, and the controlled confrontation that had dismantled years of assumed entitlement. There was no joy in retribution, only the satisfaction of clarity, the empowerment of integrity, and the quiet strength of asserting one's rightful place. This was not victory in the traditional sense, it was the reclamation of self, the restoration of visibility, and the undeniable acknowledgement of one's contributions. For the first time in weeks, the tension that had gripped me so tightly began to loosen, if only slightly. I looked around the room, observing the lingering chaos left in the wake of truths laid bare. The family had no choice but to confront reality, an uncomfortable, unavoidable truth. And as I sat there, in the soft glow of the living room, I realized that this was only the beginning of a broader reckoning. The threads of accountability had been set into motion, and the coming days would reveal just how far these truths would reach. The week after Christmas had settled over Houston like a fragile truce. Snowflakes, rare and delicate, drifted lazily from the sky, dusting the manicured lawns of the neighborhood. I had spent the days leading up to this moment in quiet preparation, reviewing documents, double-checking the legal files, and mentally rehearsing my words. That night of uninterrupted sleep had restored more than my energy. It had reinstated a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The nerves of anticipation hummed under my skin as I approached Vera's house, each step on the frosty sidewalk marking the final stretch of a long, patient reckoning. Inside, the house retained the familiar warmth, the faint scent of pine from the decorated Christmas tree lingering alongside the residual aroma of festive meals. Vera greeted me with a tense smile, her voice clipped. "One last family dinner before the year ends." Her phrasing was deliberate, almost careful, as if testing my resolve. I stepped inside and noted the subtle changes. Chairs slightly rearranged, the centerpiece on the table positioned with an exactness that suggested careful thought, a silent attempt at control. But everything that once reinforced her comfort now felt like a stage set for confrontation. I carried nothing but a small folder in my hand, receipts, legal documents, and financial proof, all meticulously arranged. I placed it on the table quietly, as though letting it speak for itself. "This time," I said softly, "I brought receipts, not food." Dinner began with the usual pleasantries, hollow and measured, but I noticed every glance, every whispered remark, and every carefully forced smile. The air was dense with anticipation. Isolde, predictably, tried to reclaim the upper hand, sitting with her posture sharp, her smile tight and rehearsed. Daisy sat beside her, unaware of the storm gathering in the quiet tension between us. Vera fussed with the silverware, glancing at me from time to time, as though gauging how much she could control or manipulate. Indira lingered in his seat, arms folded, the lines of worry etched deep into his face. The room was a perfect tableau of restrained emotion, everyone waiting for the inevitable rupture. Halfway through the dinner, Isolde, sensing a break in the surface, chose her usual weapon, mockery. "So, loser," she sneered, twirling her fork absent-mindedly. "Are you done being dramatic? Or should we expect another PowerPoint?" The air tensed. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, uncomfortable and forced. I looked down at my wine glass, swirled it slowly, and took a deliberate sip. I let the pause stretch, drawing every eye toward me before speaking. "I was the reason you had Christmas lights, Daisy's braces, and this house. Now, you'll be paying taxes on it alone." My voice was calm, measured, yet carried the weight of years of silent labor. I slid the folder across the table. It was not a gesture of confrontation, but of finality. Isolde's fork clattered onto her plate. She reached for the folder, hands trembling as her face drained of color. "You can't just do this," she stammered, as though the very air conspired against her. I met her gaze steadily. "I already did." "And by the way," I added, flipping a page to a copy of a recent invoice from her boutique's main supplier, "they prefer working with people who pay invoices." The room remained quiet, save for the soft clatter of silverware and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Isolde sank into her chair, speechless, as the gravity of her oversight and dependence crashed over her. Vera's attempt to intervene was muted, her usual defenses absent. "Maybe we were too comfortable," she said quietly, eyes cast downward. "Maybe we thought you'd never leave." I nodded once, sharp and decisive. "You weren't wrong. I only left when I realized I didn't owe anyone more silence." I stood, moving toward Daisy, kneeling to embrace her. She whispered, almost shyly, "I always knew you were the one who helped." Her small hand in mine carried a quiet affirmation that had been missing for years. I smiled, letting the warmth of that moment anchor me. "Remember that," I said. "People will try to rewrite it later." There was no bitterness in my tone, only the quiet strength of truth laid bare. The final moments of the evening were deliberately unhurried. I gathered my coat, feeling the weight of the documents now settled in the corner of the dining room. Each step toward the door was a reclamation of space, of autonomy. When I finally stepped outside, the cold air bit at my cheeks, sharp and invigorating. The sensation was almost ceremonial, a symbolic cleansing of the residue of years spent in invisible labor. I drew a deep breath, letting the chill fill my lungs, feeling the clarity and freedom that came with every exhale. For the first time, the world seemed aligned with reality as I walked down the block, each step shedding the weight I had carried silently for far too long. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of my new apartment in Seattle, casting soft stripes across the hardwood floors. It was quiet, more than I'd ever experienced in the past 15 years. No interruptions, no background noise of voices disputing credit or misremembering contributions, no whispered jabs cloaked as family banter. Just the hum of the city outside, distant and almost comforting, as if the world had paused to let me finally breathe. I held my mug of coffee, savoring the warmth, the aroma mingling with the faint scent of pine from the small tree I'd brought in for myself. My playlist hummed softly in the background, the songs I'd compiled over a decade now filling a space I could finally call my own. I sat at the small kitchen table, looking at the empty chair opposite me. The absence was profound, but liberating. I thought about the weeks leading up to this moment, the carefully compiled cost summary, the folder of evidence, the confrontation that had left the family stunned and silent. That quiet victory had not been about vengeance, but about reclaiming acknowledgement I'd long deserved. The weight of carrying unseen labor, uncredited contributions, and years of strategic invisibility had finally lifted, leaving a clarity that was almost dizzying in its simplicity. Peace, I realized, wasn't always soft. Sometimes it was the absence of apology, the cessation of expectation, the cessation of self-erasure. Elowen's video call chimed, pulling me from my thoughts. Her face appeared on my laptop screen, framed by the familiar chaos of her home office. "Seattle looks good on you," she said, voice tinged with warmth and pride. I smiled, realizing that her acknowledgement was enough. No fanfare, no accolades, just recognition. She filled me in on the ripple effects from the past week. "Isolde's boutique has temporarily closed," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Auditors have frozen certain family co-accounts. No lawsuits yet, but your family can't manipulate you anymore, not this way." I nodded quietly, listening. Seraphine had also sent a text. "They asked where you went. I told them you finally went home." There was a subtle satisfaction in knowing that even in their absence, the truth had made its presence felt. It was a quiet recalibration of power, one that didn't require shouting or confrontation. I placed my coffee cup down and opened a journal I had kept hidden since I was 19. Its cover was worn, pages yellowed, but inside lay the thoughts of a younger version of myself, hopeful, naive, and desperate to matter. I flipped to the last entry I had written before I had stopped trying. "Maybe one day, I'll matter," the words read. I paused, feeling the weight of those years condensed into a single line. Slowly, deliberately, I wrote beneath it, "You do. You always did. They just weren't ready to see it." There was a strange serenity in bridging the gap between my past and my present. Acknowledgement of the pain, yes, but also validation of my endurance and agency. The scars were visible now, but they no longer dictated my worth. The afternoon light drew long shadows across the apartment as I stepped out to a nearby park. Children's laughter echoed as they chased each other across the grass. Dogs barked excitedly, and strangers exchanged polite smiles. I walked slowly, taking in the ordinary joy that had once felt inaccessible. You don't need to forgive to be free, I thought. You just need to stop carrying the debt of their blindness. The version of myself who had tried, who had overextended, who had silently carried the weight of their oversight and manipulation, felt like a distant memory. It was comforting in a way to realize I didn't miss them. What I missed, if anything, was the resilience and hope that had driven me to care so deeply in the first place. Returning home, I set my bag on the table and opened my laptop. The blank document awaited, promising the freedom to write without restraint, without the pressure of appeasing others or bending to the distorted version of reality they preferred. I titled it deliberately, "Invisible Isn't Forever, a Memoir." The first line came naturally, almost as if it had been waiting all these years. "At Christmas dinner, my sister sneered, 'How does it feel to be a loser?' She never expected the answer to go viral." I paused, staring at the screen, absorbing the weight of that sentence and the liberation it represented. This was no longer about proving a point to them. This was for me, for my voice, long silenced, to finally speak without obstruction. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, and watched the sunlight shift across the room. The city outside continued, indifferent yet inviting, while inside I felt a quiet completion. The story that had started at that fateful dinner table had evolved, rewritten not by their judgment, but by my assertion of truth. There was no lingering bitterness, only the clarity that came from acting decisively and ethically. The new year had begun, and I was stepping fully into it, unbound, unapologetic, and undeniably present. I saved the document, closing my laptop slowly. There was a profound stillness in the apartment, a calm that had eluded me for decades. I allowed myself a deep breath, savoring the peace, the quiet triumph, the reclamation of agency. For the first time, I was writing for no one but myself, shaping the narrative of my life according to my terms. The wind whispered against the window pane, and I smiled, understanding that the story didn't end at that table. It had started there, but now it belonged entirely to me. As we close this story, remember that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish, it makes you brave. Sometimes, the people closest to us fail to see our worth, but reclaiming your voice and boundaries can change everything. What would you do if you found yourself in Astria's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore family, resilience, and justice.